Gyrocentrism. A unified field, quantum gravity theory. The underlying mechanism of gravity revealed within a universal mathematical base code. By Robert M. Evans. The current model gyrocentrism began with my conclusion that the center-seeking attractive force that we perceive as gravity is in fact an inversion of the three-dimensionally rotating centrifugal forces which are inherent to the constituent particles within the universal zero-point field. This three-dimensionally rotating mechanism ultimately had the net effect of inverting or countering those intrinsic centrifugal forces to become an attractive, center-seeking gravitational force. It has also become evident that this quantum Planck scale particle rotation was initiated by a geometric asymmetry or inhomogeneity in the eruption of the primordial Big Bang event. The current model then goes on to validate this proposal by revealing the existence of an underlying mathematical base code inherent to the fundamental properties of the universe which not only quantifies the dimensional parameters of quantum particles, and the value of a net energy gain produced by their rotation, but ultimately it also predicts a modification of Einstein's c² constant, Newton's gravitational g constant, as well as Planck's h constant by describing their underlying physical mechanisms. This mathematical base code serves to offer a solution for the unified field, quantum gravity problem by exposing several crucial mistakes in classical Newtonian physics which ultimately modifies the ad hoc parameters of these three fundamental constants. If we assume that the universe began with a massive eruption of energy, and we now deduce from the observed anisotropies in its current expansion that the so-called primal seed responsible for that event was spherically asymmetric, then we must also conclude that an intrinsic rotation must have necessarily been produced from that inhomogeneous singularity. The concept of a rotating universe has been explored in the past, from the original ideas of Ernst Mach, to George Gamow's proposal that a universal rotation may be the cause of galactic spin, up to Kurt Gödel's rotational solution for Einstein's field equations. The problem with these models historically has been the limiting factor of having only a single axial or planar rotation, which is analogous to spinning a basketball on the tip of your finger. The primary rotational axis of an asymmetrically expanding Big Bang eruption would have been completely arbitrary, causing the condensing particles to acquire a simultaneous rotation on all three spatial axes. The notion of that original primal seed as being irregular in its spherical geometry implies that an innate instability must have been inherent within its expanding dynamics, which would have necessarily caused an intrinsic asymmetry, and ultimate rotation of its expanding condensate. This presentation begins by describing a new fundamental model of particle physics which, unlike its standard model counterpart, is not constrained by an inability to integrate its mathematical format into the larger scale models of classical or semi-classical relativistic physics. This new gyrocentric model describes in a very common sense and intuitive presentation the formation of a universal ethereal zero-point field which is composed of the most fundamental of elementary photon particles. These fundamental photon particles initially condensed out of the residual energy nebulosity of the primordial Big Bang eruption, and began arranging themselves into the form of a cubic hexagonal sphere-packing configuration or zero-point field, which can be described analogously as a universal scale box full of golf balls. My pursuit of this problem has led me to a solution which describes the zero-point field as being composed of weakly interacting massive photons or WIMPs, which account for the virtual photons that randomly pop in and out of expansion cracks within the field. Each photon has an absolute minimum interacting mass of 1.333 times 10 to the negative 67 kilograms, which ultimately resolves Einstein's and de Broglie's massless photon dilemma. The current model also demonstrates that each photon has an internal architecture composed of 6 Planck particles rotating around a 7th centralized particle, while each individual Planck particle necessarily revolves simultaneously in all 3 dimensions around its own spatial axis. These photon particles are representative of the aggregate substance within what is now understood to be an all-pervading zero-point field or spin network which fills the entire universe. After analyzing the geometry of the current model, I realized that three-dimensional rotation would not only explain the attractive force that we perceive as gravity, but if the particle rotation were on only 2 axes, that a sine wave or yin-yang pattern would necessarily emerge, which ultimately demonstrates a direct causation for the wave behavior of electromagnetism. The current model gyrecentrism demonstrates that the simple geometry of simultaneous three-dimensional rotation is in fact the fundamental cause of gravity, as well as the underlying mechanism which causes the sine wave behavior of radiation.
Part 1. The physical mechanism of gravity originates from an inherent three-dimensional quantum rotation.
My approach to this problem came after considering the apparent link between gravity and centripetal force, which is defined as being a center-seeking fictitious force. My initial attempt was to associate this inverted, center-seeking dynamic as being the underlying cause of gravity, as well as being the causal mechanism for the wave behavior of radiation, and also to quantify its numerical and magnitudinal values. When I considered the geometry of three-dimensional rotation, I understood that there was in fact a method to invert the centripetal repelling dynamic, and that this method is to simply rotate a body simultaneously on all 3 of its spatial axes. Rotation around a continuously curving path creates what mainstream physicists refer to as a vector change acceleration, implying the production of a free acceleration, which they further describe as being a fictitious force. The term fictitious obviously implies the mainstream's inability to define the origin and nature of what this gyrocentric model has now determined to be the underlying mechanism of perpetual gravitational attraction. Imagine a sphere floating in free space which then has a rotational force applied to it in the x-axis. Next, a source with motion relative to this spin applies the same force in the y-axis. Similarly, a force is applied in the z-axis. This effect can be easily demonstrated using a gimbalular device. When I analyze this simultaneous triaxial rotation using geometry, I found that any point or position on this sphere would remain fixed or stationary from a pseudo-inertial frame of reference. In other words, the sphere would appear to sit perfectly still but would in fact be spinning on all 3 axes. The term pseudo-inertial refers to Einstein's false conclusion that the cosmos is infinitely large, and that there is no universally centralized Cartesian Big Bang coordinate point. This mainstream accepted notion implies that no single position in the universe can be considered as either fixed or stationary, and therefore all motion must be considered as being relative to some secondary body. It is the proposal of this model that the primordial singularity and subsequent condensate particle field expanded outward away from a singular arbitrary point into an infinite void of absolute emptiness, and that this singular point must necessarily now be considered as representative of a centralized Cartesian origin position which must be utilized as the only tangible, truly inertial or standing still reference point within the universe. This proposal rectifies Einstein's special relativistic limitation of an infinite universe with no Cartesian center as having only pseudo-inertial references frames which are confined to bodies in uniform motion. This model does not by any means suggest that special relativity is incorrect but merely implies that an absolute universal inertial reference frame does in fact exist at a primordial fixed central position which represents the initial origin coordinate of the Big Bang. The current model also demands that a three-dimensional Cartesian cubic lattice gridwork must be superimposed upon that finite expanding geometry to create an intuitive common-sense cartography system within the boundary of our toroidal-shaped universe. It is absolutely true that the primordial void of empty space is infinite, which includes the area beyond the universe's radial boundary as well as the subspace between each constituent photon, but it is also true that the photon field is finite, and that it extends for no less than the visible boundary of 13.74 billion light-years. Einstein's proposal infers that space is diffeomorphism invariant, or that it can have no point from which all observers can make an agreed-upon measurement, which subsequently creates the necessity for his special relativity theory by suggesting that all motion is relative from the perspective of an arbitrary independent observer who must consider themselves as being the only fixed stationary point in the cosmos. The current model does not suggest that Einstein's special relativity is incorrect but merely demonstrates that it is only necessary on a local scale where the central universal coordinate point cannot be accessed. It also implies that on a cosmological scale a fixed centralized Big Bang reference position must in fact exist, which ultimately supersedes Einstein's limited or relative local measurement system. Concerning the dynamics of three-dimensional rotation, if you draw a dot on the top center of a sphere, and rotate it 90 degrees on its z-axis, and then again rotate it 90 degrees on its x-axis, and finally you rotate it 90 degrees on its y-axis, you will observe that the dot returns back to its original top center position, consequently tracing a path around 1/8 or 1/8 of the sphere's surface. Now if you again rotate the sphere on all three axes but do so simultaneously, you will conclude that the dot does not move at all, similar to how the central body of a gimbalular device remains stationary or motionless when its outer rings are synchronously rotated. This implies that an actual rotation does in fact occur while an apparent perceived rotation necessarily does not occur. This notion of a perceptual reference frame determining whether actual motion has occurred is the basis of not only Einstein's special relativity theory but also of the current model. Concerning the wave behavior of electromagnetism, Newton's first law states that an object in motion will stay in motion in a straight line unless acted upon by an external force. Electromagnetic radiation or photon propagation seems to violate that postulate by appearing to travel in a sine wave path. This perception of photons traveling in a sine wave is akin to tossing a ball across a field, and observing that ball traverse the field in a transverse parabolic wave pattern. The notion of an intrinsic three-dimensional particle rotation also explains the underlying physical mechanism which creates the wave behavior of electromagnetism by demonstrating that the Newton's cradle density wave of propagating photons can only field two rotational axes of the constituent photons within the surrounding zero-point field. This necessarily causes that density wave to appear to travel in a sine wave pattern, but again only from the perspective of a pseudo-inertial reference frame. The current model has concluded that the Newton's cradle photon propagation demonstrates a wave behavior simply because each photon is synchronized with one out of three of the rotational axes of the surrounding photons in the field, which causes them to only interact with two axes. This is a result of their linear light speed exactly matching the surrounding photon's angular or rotational velocity as they propagate through the field. This synchronization has the net effect of cancelling one axis of rotation from the perspective of the photon's linear propagation because its vector direction is on average always traveling parallel to at least one rotational axis of the constituent particles within the surrounding field. The momentum transfer of photons cannot feel 1/3 or 1 out of 3 of the axial spins of the surrounding particles, which creates a transverse sine wave pattern within the density wave. This in turn causes the rest of the sublight velocity matter in the universe, including us, to perceive that radiation as appearing to travel in a transverse wave. Although this may seem extremely non-intuitive, the geometry of the current model ultimately validates this synchronization while also predicting the angular rotational velocity of these photon particles to be equal to the velocity of light. This gyrocentric model demonstrates that the outward repelling dynamic associated with centrifugal force necessarily inverts itself under three dimensions of rotation to become the underlying cause of gravity, as well as the inherent mechanism which facilitates the sine wave behavior of radiation. As a physical mechanism, this proposed inverted centripetal force can be demonstrated using a gimbal device, which creates three-dimensional rotation. The gimbal device is composed of three concentric rings connected by axles at 90-degree intervals. If all three rings are rotated at the same velocity, the smallest central ring will stand still, while the two outer rings will spin counterintuitively around it. If this three-dimensional rotation is applied to a spherical body with an internal gimbal mechanism, and power source in the microgravity of space, no motion at all will be observed. This example proposes that the energy which is input into the gimbal device must be conserved or accounted for in accordance with the second law of thermodynamics, and that because this energy is not converted into motion that it must be transmuted into mass, which implies that the sphere would get heavier, and that the true nature of mass is in fact unperceived motion. In essence, this gimbal mechanism has the capacity to convert energy into mass. Concerning the quantum particles, the most basic fundamental constituent of matter can be described as an idealized geometric construct known as the Planck particle. These most fundamental Planck particles are considered by mainstream physicists to be hypothetical mathematical constructs representing a micro-black hole threshold point which corresponds to a sphere whose 5.7297 times 10 to the negative 35 meter radius is necessarily equal to 1 radian or 1 rad. This 1 rad radius value simply represents a conversion between 360 degrees, and 2 pi, which necessarily implies an absolutely stable internal architecture composed of equilateral triangles forming a hexagon, which in 3 dimensions create a perfect structural integrity built within their geometry. I then created a simple 3-dimensionally rotating spherical model which was designed to mimic a fundamental Planck particle, and I began to analyze its geometry. Rotational vector change acceleration experiences a free fictitious force simply because of the constant differential vector change associated with its angular path. This revelation implies that Planck particles, although below the mass density interaction threshold, are not merely hypothetical constructs, and that gravity is an inverted centripetal force which is intrinsic to those most fundamental of components. Finally, I considered both Mach's proposal of rotation as being the only dynamic that can be detected without the dependence on another relative body, as well as Einstein's rotational tidal force loophole, which consequently is a violation of his own G=A principle, and I concluded that 3-dimensional rotation must necessarily be the intrinsic fundamental cause of gravity, and that it can be the only plausible solution for the unified field quantum gravity problem.
Part 2. Squaring the circle reveals an intrinsic mathematical base code within nature.
At the moment of the Big Bang, an inanimate system of quantization emerged from the combination of various natural mathematical constants as well as harmonic and fractal stability points, which now govern the progressive growth and boundary conditions of the constituent fundamental particles within the zero-point field. This quantification system incorporates multiple natural constants including pi, phi, and the harmonic to fractal growth constant of square root 2, as well as the 1111 cosmological constant. These factors begin by combining together within the two fundamental equations of pi times square root 2 divided by 1111 squared equaling 360. As well as pi times phi divided by square root 2 also equaling 360 to alternatively derive the 360-degree increment value used to quantify the circumference of a circle. Ancient Sumerian mathematicians utilized the 360 value as degrees of a circle, although their motive was reportedly based on 360 being the most convenient value because it has the most multiples. Nature's inanimate assignment of the 360 value in conjunction with the radius 1 and 2 pi circumference values utilized within a unit sphere must then be converted into radians, which represents the perfect structural integrity of a hexagon forming within the most fundamental of Planck particles, ultimately causing their radius to equal 1 rad. It has become evident that the 360 increment value used to segment the circumference of a circle was not adopted by the ancient Sumerians simply because it has the most common multiples, or because they multiplied 12 knuckles with 5 fingers to derive the 60 base time system. The natural constants which compose the equations developed by the current model in conjunction with the equality between square root 2 and 45 pi, as well as the Planck particle radius being equal to 1 rad, reveals that the 360-degree circumference segmentation was initially governed by means of an inanimate natural selection as opposed to an arbitrary human assignment. The centripetal mechanism proposed by the current model describes an intrinsic perpetual energy gain which manifests itself physically as gravity, and can be interpreted and quantified in a completely unexpected, and simplistic representation as being a ratio between the distance traced around 1/4 of the circumference of a unit radius sphere, or pi/2 divided by the length of a straight line connecting those same 2 points from top center to 90-degree side center, or √2, which equals 1111. This 1111 ratio value is equal to and synonymous with the cosmological constant, and when multiplied by the 3 spatial dimensions of the sphere becomes equal to a 3333 energy output, which must then be squared to account for the surface area representation of the Planck particle as being a micro black hole standing wave. This quantum energy gain value and mechanism is a function of the rotating gimbalular inversion, which consequently prevents any perceived rotational motion but does in fact enable the Planck particles to be displaced the pi/2 arc distance while only actually being reoriented the √2 linear distance. This discrepancy between linear and arc distances becomes the fundamental origin of the perpetual zero-point energy gain or cosmological constant, which yields a net center-seeking accelerative force into the universe that we ultimately experience as gravity. Concerning the quantification of this inverted accelerative force, a three-dimensional 2-unit side-length Cartesian cubic grid measurement system, when superimposed upon the rotating Planck particles, ultimately confines our spatial analysis to 90-degree segments, or 1/8 of a unit radius sphere, causing 1/4 of the circumference distance around that unit sphere to be equivalent to pi/2. If we instead connect those same 2 points from top center to 90-degree side center with a straight line, the distance becomes √2, implying a ratio of pi/2 divided by √2, which equals 1111. This 1111 value is in essence representative of the source origin quantity of perpetual net energy gain, or NEG, which is emitted from the quantum Planck particles, and on a macro scale corresponds exactly to Einstein's cosmological constant. The correspondence between Einstein's cosmological constant, or CC, which drives the expansion of the universe, and the NEG inverted centripetal force value demonstrates absolute proof of a quantum origin being the root cause of Hubble's accelerated universal expansion mechanism. Another amazing mathematical validation occurs within this CC to NEG correspondence, which concerns the necessity to multiply the NEG by 3 dimensions and then square that total value. This validation arises from the volume to area dimensional or exponent loss that is experienced because of the Planck particle's representation as a micro black hole surface area, and the necessity to multiply the 1111 by 3 spatial dimensions to equal the 3333 total gain value. It is apparent that a unique anomaly occurs where 1111 times 3 equals 3333, and also 3333 squared equals 1111, causing the final value of the NEG to return back to the original corresponding CC value. This also causes a 1 magnitude loss in the Planck particle's mass dimension, dropping its final scale down to a non-interacting 10⁻⁻�69, which inversely correlates to the CC magnitude of 10⁻⁻�69. This validation also demonstrates the necessity to multiply the 1111 value by the photon diameter to equal the predicted value of 3819, or 1/2618, which equals the dimensional value of 1/meters squared, or 1/phi squared. It must also be noted that under the influence of the Hubble acceleration, the photon field's expansion transitions from its three-dimensional volume onto the toroidal surface of the universe at its outer radial boundary, causing the cosmological constant value of 1111 to be square-rooted to equal the 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 output of force, which maintains the perpetual acceleration of the cyclical expansion. As further anecdotal or circumstantial evidence of this mathematical anomaly, we can simply add together the numbers of the 9 table to reveal an axiomatic inconsistency built within the fundamental nature of mathematics, which only occurs at the 9 times 11 position, implying a net gain of 1 over 9 or 1111. The fundamental nature of the 1111 series, and the necessity for a 10-base decimal system can finally be validated by simply squaring that value to derive the entire base 9 number sequence, or 1.11111 squared equals 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9. The fact that this 1111 base Archimedean series derives our 9 plus 0 decimal sequence as its square further demonstrates that our base 10 number system is not arbitrary, and is not an artifact of our ancient ancestors counting the digits of their 10 fingers and thumbs. As an alternative verification of the base 10 system being universally fundamental, it can also be demonstrated that the exact average value between pi or 3.14159, and its reciprocal 1 over pi or 3.18309 is exactly equivalent to the square root of 10 or 3.1622. This implies an absolute unique relationship between the rotational dynamic of particles represented by pi, and the base 10 decimal system represented by square root 10, which cannot be considered as arbitrary or coincidental. This revelation was uncovered by the current model, and must be considered as empirical evidence of a universally fundamental decimal system as well as an underlying mathematical code. The ultimate validation of the 1111 series being fundamental originates from the ancient Greeks, who attempted to solve a problem which they referred to as squaring the circle. Using nothing but a compass and straight edge, these ancient mathematicians attempted to superimpose a square over a circle whose respective perimeter and circumference were equivalent in length. This problem can be easily solved numerically using the most fundamental values, where the circle has a radius 1 which derives a circumference of 2 pi. We can then simply divide that circumference by 4 to derive the necessary side length value of the superimposed square, or pi over 2. At this point we can multiply the square's side length by square root 2 to derive the length of a diagonal line which bisects the square. If we now compare the length of 1/2 of that diagonal to the radius of the circle, we will derive the 9:1 ratio of the neg. It then becomes apparent that half of the square's side length, or pi over 4 multiplied by square root 2, is equal to 1111. And is necessarily also equal to pi over 2 divided by square root 2, which again redundantly validates the current model's proposal. More importantly, if we want to understand the mechanism behind this correlation, we must realize that the 9:1 ratio between the circle's radius and half of the square's diagonal exactly corresponds to their actual physical length. So it seems that the unique special property which causes these values to be of fundamental importance is that the actual linear value of their lengths are equal to the ratio between their lengths. This mathematical enigma becomes the critical revelation which ultimately describes the formation of the most fundamental stable photon particles, while also quantifying the subquantum scale production of a perpetual input of energy into the universe. The final validation of this 1111 sequence being fundamental depends on a controversial theory by two Russian scientists Mikhail Vasin and Alexander Shcherbakov. I feel compelled to include this enigmatic proof, which ultimately implies that Earth's moon is of intelligent design. Besides the preponderance of mathematical evidence already presented by Vasin and Shcherbakov, the current model has revealed new undeniable evidence which demonstrates that if we analyze the ratio between the reciprocal of the Earth and the Moon's radii, the proportions necessary to square the circle are indirectly derived. This derivation, although not immediately apparent, necessitates a simple reciprocal operation of the Earth's radius, which amazingly equals exactly pi over 2 or 1 over 6366.197 kilometers, and then a multiplication by the 1111 cc or neg value to derive the moon radius, which is consequently also amazingly equal to the reciprocal of 1 radian, equaling exactly 1 degree radian or 1745.329 kilometers, which equals 1 over 5729. This means that the radius of the Moon in kilometers is equal to the reciprocal of the Planck particle radius, or 1 over rad, and that the Earth's radius is equal to the reciprocal of pi over 2, and that they are connected by a factor of 1111. These reciprocal values exactly square the circle, which is either the most bizarre coincidence ever revealed in the history of mathematics, or they are some sort of clue left to us by the ancient engineers who designed and built our moon.
Part 3. Composition of the zero-point field.
The internal dynamics of the photon involve the rotation of 1 rad radius Planck particles revolving around a centralized 7th Planck particle, which in turn forms 6 phi diameter density clouds or seed particles, analogous to electron clouds because of their average position at high orbital velocity. These density clouds are formed by the Planck particles following the path of a Mandelbrot cardioid pattern, which ultimately configures the seed particles into an overall octahedral geometry that overlaps in a vesicoposis formation. This rotating system also produces a cross-section which amazingly conforms to the exact dimensions necessary to square the circle, forming an absolutely stable neutrally charged photon. The fractal component within the photons are the seed particle density clouds, which are simply the average position of the Planck particles that are formed as those Planck particles individually revolve around a central stationary component, consequently tracing out the Mandelbrot cardioid pattern. These seed particles represent an average position or density cloud, which occurs as a function of one spherical Planck particle cross-section rolling around another, creating a temporary proportional radius value of 0.25 within the cardioid graph. The radius of the main body of the Mandelbrot pattern is exactly equal to the photon radius, while its secondary body is exactly equal to the Planck particles. A validation of the 0.25 proportional Planck particle radius factor within the photon radius necessitates considering that a unit 1 wavelength or sine wave, when reconfigured into a standing wave, must be folded in half for lack of a better description to create a circle, or the wavelength can simply be divided into 4 parts to derive the 0.25 radius value, or lambda 1 over 4 equals 0.25. The actual physical radius of the Planck particles are 5.7297 times 10 to the negative 35 meters, giving the photon radius a value of 17.1886 or 3 times rad. The radius equation for the Planck particles initially demonstrates that pi times square root 2 over neg squared divided by 2 pi equals 1 rad, which can be simplified to 1 over neg squared times square root 2. This simplification must then be rectified to incorporate the 0.25 radius required within the cardioid graph, ultimately deriving the simplified equation of phi times square root 2 times 0.25, again equaling 1 rad. The segmentation of the Planck particle radius within the photon cross-section includes another essential proportionality factor, which I now refer to as the critical sphere radius. I originally derived this critical threshold radius value by analyzing the growth of spherical volume to spherical surface area ratios as the radius of an expanding test sphere progressively grew. I found that the surface area and volume values of this test sphere became equivalent at sphere radius 3 with mutual values of 113097, which amazingly corresponds to the reciprocal of the epsilon naught electric free space permittivity constant of 8842, or 1 over 113097. I first interpreted this critical sphere radius 3 value in a physical sense as being representative of some fundamental stability or threshold point where the sphere's surface and volume became equivalent and was possibly analogous to slowly inflating a balloon until its volume exceeded its surface area and it finally burst. I ultimately concluded through overwhelming mathematical evidence that this radius 3 value is absolutely fundamental to the growth progression of matter within the universe, and that each Planck particle radius must be considered as being divided into 3 segments, or 57297 divided by 3 equals 19098, or 1 over 5236. This also demonstrates that the Planck particle radius can be quantified as 3 times the reciprocal of the Egyptian cubit. It is also necessary to divide each Planck particle radius into 3 segments to equal a total radius of 9 within the 1.5 Planck particles that make up the photon radius to create the correct 9:1 ratio necessary to square the circle. I then realized that this 113097 critical sphere value, although seemingly arbitrary, is simply a product of the 360 degrees in a circle being multiplied by pi, which turns out to be representative of a critical threshold point where harmonic particle growth occurs. The area-to-volume correspondence of the critical sphere radius 3 within the Planck particles demonstrates their representation as micro-black holes because of the inability to penetrate into their volume, and the necessity for that volume to become their surface. The alternate value 3 segmentation of each Planck particle radius is a function of the critical sphere correspondence, which creates an overall radius value of 9 for the photon cross-section, subsequently meeting the 9:1 ratio required to square the circle within the superimposed cardioid graph. The ability of this photon configuration with internal Planck particles to square the circle within the main body of the cardioid is not a coincidence, and ultimately demonstrates an absolute correlation to the proposed underlying mathematical base code, as well as providing overwhelming evidence of the current model's accuracy. If we now consider the seed particle's spherical volume equation of 4/3 pi times phi over 2 cubed, or 4.1888 times 809 cubed, we amazingly derive the 2222 Planck mass as though that fundamental mass value had somehow originated as a function of the density cloud's volume. This correlation between the seed particle volume and the Planck mass once again redundantly validates the current model's accuracy. Concerning the derivation of the seed particle radius, we must consider the equation proposed by the current model as having a numerator of pi divided by a denominator product of n, e.g. squared times square root 2 times m sub p, where m sub p represents the Planck mass as well as the seed particle's spherical volume. Subsequently, we must also consider the more obvious simplified version of the seed particle radius as simply being rad times square root 2. Furthermore, the photon radius can simply be expressed as 3 times rad, equaling 17.1886 times 10 to the negative 34, which also corresponds to Planck time divided by pi. Planck's mainstream numerical solution for the reduced H constant, which carries the same parameters as angular momentum, is dimensionally incorrect, and is dependent on its meters squared term having the numerical value of a single meter term, which instead represents the dimensions of linear momentum. Consequently, the reduced Planck constant or reduced Planck angular momentum dimensions do exactly correspond to the actual numerical value of the photon radius, or kilograms times meters squared over seconds divided by 2 pi equals 171886. This correlation undeniably proves that the origin of the reduced Planck constant or reduced Planck angular momentum is a direct consequence of the internal rotational dynamics of the current model's proposed photon dimensions. In order to quantify the mass, density, and volume of these fundamental particles, we must begin with the seed particles, which carry the Planck mass with a diameter of phi, and a volume equivalent to its mass, deriving a density equal to 1. To calculate the photon mass and density, we simply multiply the seed particle mass by its 6 components, or 1333 equals 4/3. And then divide by its pi times 6666 volume, or 4/3 pi times 17188 cubed, deriving a density of 2 pi. The Planck particle mass is then calculated by dividing the photon mass by its 7 constituent Planck particles, equaling a value of 19097, or 1/5236. The amazing importance of these values begins with the Planck particle mass being equal to the reciprocal of the 5236 sacred Egyptian cubit value, which also corresponds to its spatial efficiency percentage, while its volume value of 78567 is equal to 1111 divided by square root 2. It must also be noted that the hexagonal cross-section of the Planck particle represents a polyhedral geometry known as the vector equilibrium. Before moving on, it must be understood that 2 mathematical progressions, harmonic and fractal, govern the stability values of quantum particles, which also accounts for the minor numerical differences within their parameter values. The Planck particles are quantified by harmonic values, while the density cloud seed particles are quantified by fractal values. The harmonic progression values culminate in the 432 perfect universal harmonic, and are a function of the 54 multiplication table, which iterates or grows in concert with the Archimedean single-digit series of 1111, 2222, etc., while also sharing the fundamental constants of pi, phi, and square root 2. Dr. Ben Rich's so-called error in the equation cryptically refers to the approximate but nearly equal stability values between the fractal and harmonic progressions, which together creates the proposed mathematical base code. Most importantly, the fractal phi value of 1618 corresponds to the harmonic value of 162, or 54 times 3, where Planck time multiplied by the velocity of light equals the Planck length. The ultimate underlying root cause of this mathematical base code enigma is the duality of the 9999 single-digit infinite series as being simultaneously both rational, and irrational, which implies either a finite or infinite quantization within the attempted measurements of nature. This enigma can simply be interpreted as mathematics' inability to describe the physical finite universe with an infinite abstract measurement system. Einstein's belief in an infinitely large universe as well as an infinitely small singularity within black holes both originated from his failure to recognize this paradox. In order to quantize the proposed 1111 net energy gain, a three-dimensional 90-degree Cartesian point space lattice must necessarily be superimposed upon the 60-degree cubic hexagonal geometry of the zero-point field. This three-dimensional grid work at first seems impossible to superimpose upon a 60-degree sphere packing geometry, at least according to the Kepler conjecture, although a cubic grid can be superimposed upon an individual sphere, which would result in each of the individual cubic grid segments having side length values of 2 units for the purpose of maintaining a radius 1 spherical analyzation. These 2-unit cubic side lengths create a radius value of 1 for each individual sphere, causing it to have a 2 pi circumference, which necessarily conforms it to the values of the squaring the circle geometry. This ultimately demonstrates that three-dimensional rotation only requires 90 degrees of angular displacement or 1/8 of a cubic lattice cell to establish a symmetric base unit measurement system, and quantify the centripetal vector inversion energy gain mechanism. Kepler concluded that this problem of integrating a 90-degree coordinate system into a 60-degree sphere packing geometry was unprovable, which resulted in his Kepler conjecture spatial efficiency solution of 74.047%. The Kepler conjecture reveals a mathematical dilemma involving the segmentation of a cubic hexagonal sphere packing configuration analogous to stacked oranges in a grocery store or golf balls in a box, to the extent that it demonstrates the apparent inability to symmetrically superimpose a three-dimensional 90-degree Cartesian grid work upon such a geometry and subsequently derive its exact spatial efficiency. Amazingly, the current model's analysis of the geometry of the zero-point field has revealed a rigorous solution for the 74.047 Kepler conjecture, which also accurately incorporates the predicted single Planck particle spatial efficiency of 52.36%. Determining the overall geometric arrangement of the photons within a zero-point field depends on the perceived difference between CCP cubic close packing and HCP hexagonal close packing, which can be described as the CCP having its spheres in a non-saddled cubic configuration. This appears to be less spatially efficient but turns out to be unavoidable, because when an HCP rhomboidal configuration is arbitrarily rotated by 60 degrees on two of its axes, we see that its components are necessarily already in the unsaddled CCP configuration. This simply means that when the saddled rhomboidal geometry is rotated 60 degrees on its x-axis, and 60 degrees on its y-axis, that it is exactly the same as the unsaddled cubic geometry, implying that these two configurations are in fact exactly the same, and will now be referred to by the current model with the combined convention of cubic hexagonal. After the Big Bang eruption, the subsequent nebulosity began condensing itself into photons whose geometric arrangement formed a cubic hexagonal lattice configuration with a spatial efficiency of 74.047%. This efficiency value corresponds to the Kepler conjecture, while a single Planck particle component can be quantified within a smaller 2-rat side length cubic volume with a spatial efficiency of 52.36%. Although the seed particle's mass is a function of its volume and density, the Planck particle's mass must be quantized as being equivalent to the reciprocal of its 52.36% spatial efficiency value. This is a consequence of the Planck particle's volume being represented by its surface area, giving it the status as a micro black hole standing wave. The current model ultimately reveals a fundamental correspondence between these two spatial efficiency values, which proves that Kepler's overall 74.047% conjecture, when divided by the 52.36% single particle spatial efficiency, necessarily derives a square root 2 constant of proportionality. This incredible revelation of a square root 2 constant, which initially occurred between the first Planck particle to seed particle iteration, reveals another undeniable validation to the proposed underlying mathematical base code. The importance of the 5236 value was originally recognized by the Egyptians as being the most fundamental unit measurement of distance, but has now been revealed as also having a correlation to the Planck particle spatial efficiency or mass value, while also having an inherent connection to the base 10 decimal system. The quantization of an individual Planck particle requires a 90-degree Cartesian segmentation where each fundamental spherical unit partially occupies 8 fractional unit cells with a 52.36% spatial efficiency, or 4/3 pi divided by 8. This 5236 value also equals phi squared times 2, which again corresponds to the sacred Egyptian cubit, as though that ancient culture were somehow aware of the mathematical properties of the zero-point field.
Part 4. A modification of Einstein's equivalence principle, and an alternate method of deriving the fundamental Planck units.
The SI unit measurement system is accepted by mainstream physicists as being composed of the 5 fundamental unit parameters of kilograms, meters, and seconds, which represent mass, length, and time, as well as the Coulomb and Boltzmann constants. The Boltzmann electric charge constant is a function of particle rotation, while the Coulomb constant simply represents a temperature conversion. The current model ultimately implies that Planck's method of derivation was incorrect, and that all of the fundamental quantum parameters can alternately be derived from the 3 truly intrinsic units of length, velocity, and energy. The mainstream method of deriving the SI base unit values comes from Max Planck's notion of combining together certain natural constants, and utilizing the experimental results of Cavendish's Earth mass calculation. Subsequently, the current model has revealed an alternate truly fundamental method of derivation, which proposes that the 3 parameters of length, velocity, and energy are the only truly intrinsic base units that can be derived from the innate properties of the universe, and that together these parameters are sufficient to extrapolate all other fundamental unit values. The first truly intrinsic parameter is the fractally iterating distance value of phi, or 1.618, which represents the Fibonacci ratio, but more importantly it represents the side length of the golden rectangle. This fundamental length unit value can be divided by the universal light velocity speed limit to derive the first unknown base unit value of Planck time, or 5.393. This leaves us with the problem of how to derive the mass value without using Planck's proposed mainstream method, which incorporates experimental results, and utilizes other so-called universal constants that consequently already contain mass values. The current model has determined that the physical property of mass can be described as the reactive potential energy recoil from Newton's action-reaction third law being absorbed by a primary body exerting an acceleration or push on a secondary body, as was indirectly proposed by Einstein's special relativity theory but did not account for the associated recoil motion to the primary body. Einstein did not account for reaction in special relativity but assumed that primary bodies remained stationary. This model implies that mass is simply the recoil motion of the primary body that cannot be perceived because of the absence of a stationary inertial reference frame within the universe, which is exactly why Einstein assumed the necessity for the primary body to become the inertial frame. If being in uniform motion is the same as being at rest as Einstein proposed, then mass must be a manifestation of that unperceived motion. The mainstream description of inertia is defined as a force that resists an attempt to accelerate a body, which in essence is the same false perception of that primary body being stationary rather than being recoiled. This implies that the only true manifestation of so-called mass is inertia, and that mass does not really exist. Einstein originally postulated that same conjecture but was unable to precisely explain it. To briefly describe Planck's representation of both mass and energy, we must first understand his proposed energy equation, which implies that E equals h bar over T sub p, although we absolutely know that the dimensions of h bar are kilograms times meters squared over seconds, which already contains a mass term. Energy is expressed in joules or kilograms times meters squared over seconds squared, which contains a kilogram parameter, demonstrating that the mass term absolutely must be established first. Consequently, the truth which has been uncovered by the current model implies that we must turn to the origin of the energy parameter in order to derive an accurate fundamental mass term where energy has a numerical value of 2, and a magnitude value of 10 to the negative 52. The energy term turns out to have an alternate non-mainstream explanation for its origin and method of derivation, which has been uncovered by the current model, ultimately allowing the mass term to be derived. We know from Newton's third law of action-reaction that when a force is applied to a body, that an equal and opposite force is necessarily exerted 180 degrees in opposition to the initial force. This means that if 1 unit of energy is expended by a body, then it must in reality be considered as only 1/2 of a unit of energy being given to its opponent, because the other 1/2 unit is being recoiled or absorbed into itself. This is precisely why the kinetic energy formula of 1/2 mv squared has its 1/2 factor. The 1/2 factor compensates for Newton's action-reaction third law, which according to the current model must be interpreted as a separation of kinetic and potential energy S, where any given body exerting an acceleration on another body must consider itself as being recoiled in the opposite direction. Either it acquires motion or it acquires mass, which implies that mass is in essence unperceived motion. This also justifies the notion that these two states of energy must always cancel out to equal 0. Special relativity implies that if in the microgravity of interstellar space a primary body pushes or accelerates a secondary body, that each opposing mass will perceive itself as standing still, and must therefore uniquely conclude that if the perceived initial output of energy is interpreted as having a unit value of 1, then the total actual output of energy must have in fact had a value of 2, which consequently is now the reason that our fundamental base unit of energy must also be quantified as having a value of 2. At first this sounds naive, and coincidental, but the mathematical evidence ultimately demonstrates its accuracy. It has now become evident that the Planck base unit of energy must equal 2 because the action-reaction separation of kinetic and potential energy requires an equal output of 1 unit of kinetic energy and 1 unit of recoil potential energy, which means that the abstract notion of mass is simply the potential energy acquired by the unaccounted for recoil of an applied acceleration. This brings us to the problem of understanding the new energy equation, which the current model has determined can simply be described as the product of the cubic Planck length, or phi cubed, times the spherical spatial efficiency of one Egyptian cubit divided by the neg, or 4236 times 5236 divided by 1111 equals 2. These factors do not utilize any mass parameters but do allow an energy term to be derived. This revelation of a value 2 base energy unit, as Planck also indirectly concluded from Cavendish's experimental results, allows us to mathematically derive the Planck mass value using multiple equations, including E equals mc squared, or 2 equals 2222 times 9. And also F equals ma, or 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 equals 2222 times 5555. But more importantly, mass can be derived from its most fundamental representation as being the product of density times volume at the quantum scale, which amazingly can be alternately expressed with the exclusive use of the phi ratio, or 5236 times 4236 equals 2 times phi squared times phi cubed, or 2 times phi to the 5th equals 2222. If we now incorporate all of the previously derived base units, we can infer an acceleration value of 5555 meters per second squared, which can then be multiplied by our new mass value of 2222 to derive the modified F equals m, a force value of 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9, which undeniably reveals the critical piece of overwhelming evidence of not only the accuracy of this model but also of the existence of its proposed universal mathematical code, and also its inherent incorporation of the fundamental base 10 decimal system. The true nature of mass has never been precisely defined by mainstream physicists, although this geocentric model has succeeded in deriving an alternate set of parameters which now reveal a concise description of its origin. The following two alternate mass equations utilize a moment of inertia term to reveal the origin of mass as also having a rotational dynamic as well as an undeniable correlation between the Archimedean repeating decimal series, the phi golden rectangle value, and the base 10 decimal sequence, which ultimately creates a fundamental correlation between Newton's second force law F equals ma, and Einstein's mass-energy equivalency E equals mc squared. The scale inconsistency between Planck mass being at 10 to the negative 52 rather than 10 to the negative 8, as modified by the current model, originates from Planck's arbitrary false assumption that he was required to zero out or balance the 10 to the 16th magnitude of the c-squared constant over or across the unit 1 position on the number line. Planck's false assumption placed the 10 to the 16th c-squared magnitude value balanced on 10 to the 0, therefore creating a mass term with a magnitude of 10 to the negative 8, and an energy term with magnitude 10 to the 9th in his naive attempt to neutralize the final energy, and mass magnitudes back to 0. Planck had absolutely no other motivation to set the energy and mass values at these arbitrary magnitudes, while mainstream physicists now foolishly struggle over the conundrum of the Planck mass having such an extremely large value. The mass-energy transmutation described by Einstein's equivalence principle, or E equals mc squared when decomposed, proposes an equality between the energy contained within a body, and the product of its mass multiplied by the square of the speed of light. Einstein inserted this c-squared term into his equation because of the numerical, dimensional, and magnitude requirements for a constant with the value of 9 times 10 to the 16 meters squared per seconds squared. This was based on Planck's energy value being equal to 2 joules, and his mass value being equal to 2222 kilograms. Einstein's notion of a speed of light squared term from a naive understanding implies two velocities multiplied together, which is not representative of any intuitive physical mechanism. If this c-squared constant represented a velocity, it would be considerably faster than his proposed universal speed limit of 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. The current model has concluded that proportionality constants such as c-squared must be representative of an actual physical mechanism, and cannot just be meaningless arbitrary mathematical values which are inserted ad hoc into equations to rectify their numerical and dimensional inconsistencies. Einstein's use of the c-squared term makes absolutely no physical sense if it is considered to be a velocity, since Einstein himself postulated that superluminal or faster than light speeds cannot be achieved. Louis de Broglie, who prescribed to Einstein's proposal that a photon of light cannot have the physical property of mass, algebraically manipulated the kilograms parameter within Einstein's E equals mc squared equation to become a momentum term, which seemingly avoided the inclusion of a mass term. Ultimately, de Broglie's attempt was frivolous, since his new momentum parameter of kilograms times meters per second necessarily also contains a mass term. Consequently, the current model has determined that the photon does have an absolute minimum mass magnitude of 10 to the negative 68, which gives it the lowest possible density able to weakly interact with the other constituent photons within the zero-point field. This model has also revealed the correct modification of the c-squared term by considering the analogy of an astronaut Bob who pushes or accelerates another astronaut Alice a given distance while perceiving himself as remaining stationary in the void of empty space. Bob must then divide his total exerted energy value by the product of those two acceleration times distance terms to derive the numerical value of the abstract mass parameter. The following numerical, dimensional, and magnitude analyses of the modified c-squared constant utilizes a set of unit parameters which physically describe its fundamental nature and origin, and ultimately derive an accurate value of 9 times 10 to the 16th meters squared per seconds squared. This current model's modification of Einstein's equivalence principle can in no way be considered as a coincidence, but must be regarded as overwhelming empirical evidence of its accuracy, and also as further evidence of the existence of an intrinsic mathematical base code. This modification also reveals that the E equals mc squared formula can alternatively, and more importantly, be expressed as E equals m over cc, or energy is equal to mass divided by the cosmological constant, where c squared equals the reciprocal of cc. The significance of this gyrocentric modification must not be complacently overlooked or underestimated by the physics community. The numerical values which have been derived by the current model demonstrate an overwhelming preponderance of empirical evidence that proves the existence of a universal base code within the underlying structure of nature, and ultimately quantifies all Planck scale quantum parameters.
Part 5. Deriving the Newtonian G constant and its correlation to the elementary charge and fine structure constants.
The following modification of the gravitational G constant began as the proposal for a new model of quantum gravity but ultimately evolved into nothing less than a complete understanding of the geometry of the zero-point field. I initially realized that in order to clearly describe the conclusions of this model that I must begin by uncovering the critical historical mistakes which led mainstream physicists to their current conundrum, and subsequent inability to resolve this quantum gravity problem. My research has concluded that besides the discrepancy between the dimensional and numerical values of the Planck constant and c² constant, that the main initial problem within classical physics arose much earlier between Kepler's third law of planetary motion and its correspondence to Newton's attempted reconciliation between his gravity and force equations. Modern celestial mechanics equations demonstrate that Kepler's laws of planetary motion exactly describe the force of gravity between two large-scale planetary bodies, or what might better be interpreted as two bodies which have a low proportionality to each other because of their similar size. Kepler's constant, which according to historical accounts was not included into his third law until what has now been referred to as the modern-day interpretation, implies a serious dimensional problem within the standard model of classical physics. The primary problem which has revealed itself concerns the addition rather than multiplication of the two mass terms within the opposing formulations. Kepler's constant as well as the equations of modern celestial mechanics originally utilized an addition of masses, or m1 plus m2, while Newton's gravity formula, and the original inverse square law, proposed a multiplication of masses, or m1 times m2. Concerning this change from multiplication to addition, to put it simply, Kepler understood that when two bodies gravitationally interact, their masses must be considered as two separate fractional pieces of the same total body as is now used in celestial mechanics, and that this m1 plus m2 total mass represents a sum of their individual fractions. It is most important to understand that the added masses of two individual bodies is exactly the same as a piece being broken off of a larger primary body and being separated into two fractions, while any subsequent gravitational rejoining must ultimately be considered as simply an addition of those two fractions. We must understand that the multiplication of masses operation, although dogmatically accepted by mainstream physics within the inverse square law, and also Newton's gravity equation, just does not make any mathematical sense, simply because if one of the mass terms has a unit 1 value, then their total product will not change. The immediate response that I normally receive concerning my proposal of a change from multiplication to addition of masses is that I must be mistaken, and that Newton must be correct because his gravity formula and also the inverse square law has worked for such a long time. Newton's use of multiplication actually can work to a relatively high degree of accuracy if the proportionality between the bodies is very high, like Galileo's small 1 kilogram balls falling toward the large 6 trillion kilogram planetary body of Earth, because their total multiplied magnitude would not change by any significant amount, or in that case not at all. The previous example of a 1 kilogram body being multiplied by a 6 times 10 to the 24th kilogram body demonstrates that the use of multiplication of masses must be mathematical nonsense, since the inevitable multiplication by a unit 1 mass does not change its product, which is the precise reason why Kepler originally used addition. Conversely, if the mass proportionality between the two bodies is relatively low, or if the bodies have similar mass magnitudes, then we are at liberty to use the apparently overlooked reduced mass term or mu factor, which is equal to the reciprocal of the sum of reciprocals of the two masses, or mu equals 1 divided by 1 over m1 plus 1 over m2. Consequently, this mu term should not be mistaken for the closely related standard gravitational parameter, or mu equals gm, which may ultimately be used within the same equation. The reduced mass term mu is used in the exact same capacity that the Lorentz gamma factor is used to transform velocities which are of a low proportionality to the speed of light. Einstein recognized the necessity for a modification to Newton's gravity equation concerning velocities and utilized the Lorentz transformation, but overlooked the similar problem of reducing the mass terms. The Lorentz gamma term is commonly omitted for the sake of convenience and simplification, since the majority of equations involving velocities have such a high proportionality to the speed of light. Similarly, the majority of two-body gravitational problems also have high fractional proportionalities between their primary and secondary masses, for example rockets leaving the Earth or bodies being dropped from altitude. In high proportionality velocity equations, Galilean transformations seem to work, although we do understand that there is no line we must cross or amount we must exceed before we should begin using the Lorentz gamma term. Technically, the Lorentz factor should be used in all equations containing velocities regardless of their magnitude, and likewise the reduced mass term mu should also be used in all equations containing masses. We must understand that the product of masses numerator term which Newton adopted from the inverse square law must be changed dimensionally from m1 times m2 into m1 plus m2, or simply m1 plus 2, having the ultimate effect of eliminating one of the mass terms. Newton merely used the more simplified product of masses in his inverse square gravity formula because of the high proportionality of his and Galileo's 1 kilogram ball experiments, rather than following Kepler's sum of masses convention. So Newton's gravity formula, along with its ad hoc big G constant, was born, with a set of untenable dimensional parameters which included an unnecessary mass term in its numerator. The new modified gyrocentric version of Newton's classical gravity formula can be described as its first term having an r² denominator as was originally proposed within the inverse square law, but having its product of masses numerator modified into a sum of masses. This modification ultimately eliminates one of the mass parameters by incorporating the reduced mass mu factor, which results in the loss of one of its kilogram dimensions, or m1 plus m2 over r squared equals m1 plus 2 over r squared. Newton's adaptation of the inverse square law and its multiplication of masses turned out to be the fork in the road which lead classical physics astray, and created the inability for future physicists to solve or even detect the G constant's dimensional conundrum. The second modification concerns the big G constant, whose mainstream interpretation has absolutely no correlation whatsoever to any physical mechanism within our modern system of quantification. The mainstream accepted G constant dimensions with its denominator mass term fails to describe any comprehensible physical function, while this new modified gyrocentric interpretation completely validates its dimensional parameters with a corresponding intuitive common sense physical mechanism. These modified parameters can also be validated by recognizing their correlation to Kepler's third law constant of k equals s squared over m cubed, or k is equal to seconds squared divided by meters cubed. The parameters proposed by Kepler represent the exact reciprocal of the modified G constant. The current model's new parameters of surface acceleration or meters squared times meters per seconds squared represents a zero-point photon field whose expansion forces its component photon particles to transition from the three-dimensional volume of space, and be squeezed onto the two-dimensional toroidal exterior surface of the universe at its finite radial boundary, and then ultimately be accelerated back again into its three-dimensional volume at either of its polar entrances. It must be understood that on a fundamental harmonic Planck unit scale this modification of the g constant needs its surface acceleration product to be multiplied by pi over square root 2 in order to derive its mainstream accepted 6626 value. Consequently, if we utilize the current model's fractal value modification without the pi over square root 2 term, then we will derive a new value for the g constant of 14548, which when multiplied by the first term of m over r squared necessarily derives the predicted m of force value of 123456789. This is obviously correct, and must be accepted by the mainstream physics community as overwhelming proof of the current model's accuracy. The current model has uncovered another alternative proof of its accuracy, which involves an algebraic rearrangement of the alpha fine structure constant. This alpha formula amazingly demonstrates an exact correlation to Kepler's spatial efficiency conjecture while also alternatively solving the enigmatic elementary charge equation with an algebraic rearrangement, which consequently turns out to be a modified version of its mainstream accepted formula. Furthermore, the elementary charge value given in coulombs exactly correlates to the relativistic electron mass parameter of 0.5116 MeV over c squared by simply shifting that elementary charge value by one decimal place or by multiplying it by the square root of 10. What is most important is that we understand the current model's revelation that the true mechanism of the alpha electromagnetic interaction strength is that of a coupling constant between the aggregate photons which compose the zero-point field's cubic hexagonal sphere packing architecture. Furthermore, although this fine structure constant is cryptically represented by its reciprocal value, which has been modified by the current model to equal 1 over 135049, it is in fact exactly equivalent to the Kepler conjecture spatial efficiency. The squared representation of the elementary charge within the alpha constant equation is also cryptically represented, which surreptitiously is a means of implying two possible numerical solutions for that fundamental charge value if its decimal point is shifted by one magnitude or if it is multiplied by square root 10, which also happens to be exactly equal to h bar times c. These two solutions not only reveal a correlation between the elementary charge and phi, which infers the fundamental nature of its value, but it also reveals a correspondence to the relativistic electron mass of 0.5116 mega-electron-volts over c squared using the square root 10 decimal shift. Both of these revelations together cannot be a coincidence but demand a complete re-evaluation of the current model's proposal of alpha's underlying physical mechanism, since the mainstream understanding of its function is completely inadequate, and has yet to offer any explanation of its vague definition. Deriving the elementary charge reveals a correlation between its relativistic mass quantization or mega-electron-volts over c squared, and its Coulomb unit value, which is necessarily a function of the square root of 10. This correlation also reveals that we can simply multiply the Planck charge or Q sub p by the square root of alpha or by the square root of the Kepler conjecture to derive the electron mass in either of its unit forms. So it seems that the current model's description of three-dimensional or triaxial rotation must in fact be the fundamental cause of gravity, and that it necessarily does facilitate the redirection of inertia inward toward the center of a body's mass. This gyrocentric model not only explains the origin and cause of gravity, but it also demonstrates that the sine wave behavior of light shares that mutual causation, subsequently unifying the micro and macro regimes of the universe. In summary, the previous dimensional analysis verifies that the mainstream accepted parameters of the Newtonian G constant are incorrect, and that this new gyrocentric formulation accurately describes its true dimensions. The mathematical link between the cosmological and quantum scales is clearly evident, and can by no means be denied. This evidence cannot be interpreted as coincidental but must be accepted as a paradigm shift, and ultimate solution for the so-called unified field problem.
Contact Robert M. Evans. Gyrocentrism70@gmail.com. Phone number 443-978-2599.